WVEC TV, plan.
Here we go.
This is Jim Terry, ABC News.
U.S. naval ships stand ready in port. Maneuvers at sea refine and hone naval readiness to a polished edge. Hulking waves of steel equipped with technology unfathomed by ancient mariners, and yet advanced beyond our own imaginations. Ticonderoga, America, Constitution, Nimitz, George Washington, Coral Sea, Enterprise. Names that do more than simply christen today's monoliths onto the seas. They are names which also reflect a rich past, abounding with people, places, and battles. Today's great ships are direct descendants of their seagoing ancestors. The great ships of our past demonstrated their ability to protect and defend U.S. interests throughout the world, and pioneered new ideas that would evolve into today's modern fleets. From the square riggers to the nuclear-powered vessels, all have earned the right to be called great ships of the U.S. Navy. Our look at great ships begins in colonial America. Early colonies grew fast and strong. Timber harvested from virgin forests provided the tall masts for sailing ships, and agricultural commodities were traded for goods across the seas. However, abuses and excessive taxation led to discontent with British rule and ultimately revolt. The war for independence had begun. And while the proud colonists were prepared to fight valiantly on land for home and hearth, England's dominance at sea could deal mighty blows to colonial war efforts. It immediately became evident that a successful outcome would require a navy. The Navy must have the casting vote, are words spoken by George Washington reinforcing the need for naval engagements to support ground action against the British. The push for a navy had begun. The colonists were no strangers to the seas or to shipbuilding, but owned no warships of their own. Daring land assaults against British ships anchored in ports and the purchase of ships from France made a continental navy possible. It wasn't long before it began to make its presence felt. Bold raids against the British homeland ports by the Ranger under the command of John Paul Jones taught England that her navy could no longer be considered a purely offensive weapon. She would have to hold back ships for her own defense. In addition, naval engagements at sea by the Continental Navy and its ally France, while not always successful, interrupted the British Navy's blockade of the colonial ports and distracted British fleets from coming to the aid of their tattered land forces during the battle between Cornwallis and George Washington at Yorktown. The Continental Navy, while not a serious threat to the superior British fleets, had fought valiantly and helped to keep the Revolution alive. Most notably, the naval engagement between the Bonhomme Richard, named after Poor Richard, Benjamin Franklin, with the British frigate Serapis. Richard, captained by John Paul Jones, was greatly outmatched by the British ship of the line. Jones' only hope was to outmaneuver the bigger ship and deliver quick, raking fire. The battle raged, however, in favor of Serapis. Richard, devastated by continuous blasts from her foe, lay burning with only one gun still able. When British victory appeared imminent, the captain of the Serapis maneuvered alongside Richard and demanded her flag and surrender. Jones replied, "Strike my colors, sir, I have not yet begun to fight." These words so inspired his men that they continued the battle hand to hand. In all, the battle lasted over 3.5 hours. Jones, after losing 50% of his men as well as the Bonhomme Richard, emerged victorious. With With the Revolutionary War ended, the need for warships was superseded by the need for merchant ships. The Navy found itself idle and in a state of decay. By 1785, the Continental Navy ceased to exist. Such would be the trend throughout history. Periods of expansion and enthusiasm would be followed by neglect and disinterest during times of peace. Merchant shipping, however, found the decade following the Revolution to be one of great opportunity. Trading for goods throughout the world produced a thriving merchant marine with capable ships and sailors, but with little provision for defending its precious cargoes. Soon, U.S. merchant ships fell prey to pirates from the Barbary states along trade routes. America's anger over the marauding and ransoming of her merchant ships finally forced Congress to act. On March 27, 1794, authorization to build warships was approved. The official beginning of the United States Navy had begun. Monies were appropriated for the building of 6 frigates, with contracts distributed to shipbuilders along the Atlantic coast. However, before significant work on the ships had been completed, a peace agreement was struck between the United States and Algiers. Once again, the need for naval force and the allocation of millions of dollars for its construction was questioned. After lengthy debate, Congress approved the completion of only 3 frigates: the United States, the Constitution, and the Constellation. These ships were the first of a class of fighting ships designed specifically for the United States Navy. Modern warships with hulls designed for strength, speed, and maneuverability, and armed with long-barreled cannons capable of firing 24-pound balls at long range, as well as short-barreled guns for close range. Meanwhile, the United States found itself embroiled in conflict with its former ally, France, who contended that treaties between England and the United States were detrimental to her interests. France demonstrated her anger with a campaign of harassment against U.S. merchant ships. "Millions for defense, but not 1 penny in tribute," was our reply, and the United States found itself in an undeclared war with France. Our 3 war frigates were assigned to active duty and made sail for the Caribbean to protect American interests. The Constellation, under the command of Captain Thomas Truxtun, would be the first to distinguish herself in battle. Cruising in the West Indies, Constellation fell in with a large warship disguising herself as an American vessel. She was, in fact, the French man-of-war Insurgent. Truxtun, suspicious of the ship, called the Constellation to quarters and made ready for battle. Insurgent abandoned her disguise and prepared to fire. Constellation fired first and struck Insurgent broadside, but Insurgent returned fire and swerved toward Constellation in an attempt to board. Constellation, being faster and more maneuverable, moved across the bow of Insurgent and raked her with merciless fire at close range. Within 90 minutes, the French vessel was reduced to a hammered ruin, with dead or wounded numbering over 70. Constellation suffered minimal damage, losing only 1 man. Constellation fought disciplined battles throughout the undeclared war with France, often challenging larger and more experienced French warships. Victory would be her legacy throughout the world and throughout various wars. During the War of 1812, for example, she was dispatched to Hampton Roads, where she single-handedly held fast against all British attempts to overtake the blockhouse fortification on Craney Island. Later, she undertook a variety of actions to protect American interests, ranging from trade route protection to intercepting slave traders. She saw action in the Mediterranean during the Civil War and was ultimately returned to Hampton Roads, where she served as a receiving and training vessel. The Constellation rendered her final service during World War II, when she was assigned to shore base relief for the Atlantic Fleet. She was decommissioned on February 4, 1955, after having served faithfully during 5 wars. The Constellation played a significant role in the development of the U.S. Navy by helping to demonstrate the importance of sea power in a global, political, and economic environment. During the years between the end of the War of 1812 and the beginning of the Civil War, the U.S. Navy found itself involved in a variety of tasks. Principal among them was protection and promotion of commerce by sea. It was also a time of experimentation and development. Work was pioneered and developed on steam-powered vessels, paddle-wheel propulsion, screw propellers, shell-firing weaponry, and improved ship design. But it was not until the Civil War that the country would witness a new breed of ships that would change the face of seagoing vessels forever. The South, severely lacking in adequate quantity and quality of true war vessels, experienced significant difficulty with Union blockades along its coasts. Much-needed supplies were being cut off, and the defense of its ports was tenuous. Confederate Secretary of the Navy Stephen Mallory, 1 month after the fall of Fort Sumter, made this observation: "I regard the possession of an iron-armored ship as a matter of first necessity." With that, the building of the first ironclad was set into motion. The Merrimac, a Union steam frigate that was burned down to its berth deck, was hauled into dry dock at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, and the start of a U.S. shipbuilding revolution began. Atop the center of this deck was built a sloping-sided, round-ended citadel, plated with 4 inches of iron and armed with 6 9-inch smoothbores and 4 heavy rifles. The ends were flush with the water and housed 1 7-inch rifle at each end. Her bow fitted with a 1,500-pound iron tooth for ramming. She was completed and renamed the Virginia. When word of this Confederate ship reached the Union, they began work on a similar vessel. After much debate, a design of a marine engineer named John Erickson was adopted. His ship was to be called the Monitor. Construction began in the North on one of the most remarkable warships ever built. She contained over 40 patented inventions. The Monitor, unlike the Virginia, was built from the ground up. It had a hull design shaped like a football, with a round tower protruding from the center. The hull was nearly flush with the water and armored. The tower was an armored turret, which turned on a pivot housing and contained 2 large guns. The ship's design made her difficult to hit, and any part that could be hit would be immune to shot. March 8, 1862. Virginia steamed to Hampton Roads, where its first naval engagement was to take place. Anchored in the Roads were 2 Union sailing ships, the Cumberland and the Congress, blockading the James River. At anchor outside the Roads were 2 Union steam frigates, the Minnesota and the Roanoke. Virginia made for the Cumberland first. With rapid fire, she poured round after round into Cumberland's bow, killing or wounding 1/10 of her crew. Virginia then drove her tooth-like ram deep into Cumberland, inflicting the killing blow. Within moments, she slid to the bottom with 1/3 of her crew and her flag still flying. Virginia next turned her attentions toward the Union ship Congress and disposed of her in similar fashion. With her skipper and 120 of her men killed or wounded and the ship burning throughout, Congress hauled down her flag. The Minnesota, after having witnessed the devastation inflicted on her sister ships, decided to steam toward Newport News to avoid the same fate, but ran hard aground on a sandbar and lay stranded. Virginia's captain, having been slightly injured during the battle with Congress, decided to halt the action temporarily and return to port for the night. Daybreak brought the continuation of the battle with one remarkable twist. There, positioned between the Virginia and the stranded Minnesota, lay what one observer aboard the Virginia described as a floating shingle with a cheese box in the center, the Monitor. The Virginia, paying no attention to the strange craft, set her sights on the Minnesota, sending rounds of fire over the Monitor into the Minnesota. The Monitor fired back with a 168-pounder, striking the Virginia with such impact that every man on that side was thrown to the deck, inflicting, however, no serious damage. Virginia then turned her attention completely on Monitor. Both ships maneuvered for position, firing as they went. Virginia, able to fire more rapidly than her opponent, sent shot hurling toward the Monitor, but likewise inflicting no serious damage. The 2 ironclads engaged in battle for over 4 hours at distances from 50 feet to 100 yards, but neither could uncover a weakness in its opponent. Finally, the battle was broken off. The Virginia steamed back to Norfolk. The Monitor remained in control of Hampton Roads. Both sides claimed victory, but the battle, which would become one of the most infamous in naval history, was in fact a draw. In the end, the Virginia never again returned to battle. She became stranded in Norfolk with virtually no escape route. The Confederacy was left with no option but to scuttle her rather than allow her to fall into enemy hands. The Monitor sank off Cape Hatteras during a storm while on her way to take part in an attack on Charleston. Contribution and innovation to the U.S. Navy came in many forms. However, the Ironclads became the symbol of superiority during this period in history and became a stepping stone to the modern Navy. At the close of the Civil War, the United States had amassed the largest and most powerful Navy in the world. However, once again, the political mood of the country would turn against naval strength. Deeply in debt from the war and eager to begin reconstruction, the Navy was neglected. There would be no appropriation for new ships and only a minimal allocation for maintaining the existing fleet. Throughout this period, supporters of a strong seagoing Navy persisted, arguing that a strong Navy was essential to demonstrate the nation's strength and prestige around the world. Finally, March 3, 1883, Congress agreed to fund 4 new ships. The Steel Navy was born. However, having fallen behind in shipbuilding and technology, these first ships, the Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, and Dolphin, were a blend of the old and the new. Each contained twin propellers, but with outmoded engines and boilers. They were outfitted with full sail rigging, yet they contained complete electrical circuitry, double bottoms, and watertight compartments. But most importantly, these ships signaled a return to naval importance and growth that would continue throughout the following years. Remember the Maine became a rallying cry that whipped public sentiment for war into a frenzy. The mysterious sinking of the U.S. ship Maine, anchored in Havana Harbor in Cuba, became the spark that ignited a war with Spain. The Spanish-American War lasted only 4 months, from April to August 1898, but involved 2 major naval engagements that would once again reinforce sentiments in favor of a strong U.S. Navy. Theodore Roosevelt, who was then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, began frantic preparations for a war at sea. A U.S. fleet of ships, which was operating near Hong Kong under the command of Commodore George Dewey, was ordered to mobilize and strike out for Manila Bay. The fleet, comprised of the Olympia, Baltimore, Boston, and Raleigh, along with the gunboats Concord, Petrel, and McCulloch, steamed over 600 miles in 3 days. Early in the morning of May 1, 1898, Dewey boldly maneuvered his ships through a narrow, heavily fortified passage leading to Manila Bay. There he engaged a Spanish fleet. "You may fire when ready, Gridley," shouted Dewey, and U.S. guns roared. As the battle raged, dense smoke covered both fleets, making it impossible for either side to aim. And by 7:30 a.m., the shooting broke off. When the smoke finally cleared, it became apparent that the U.S. fleet had inflicted punishing blows to her opponent. In less than 2 hours, the Spanish fleet lay burning, with over 1/3 of its men killed or badly wounded. The only other significant naval engagement occurred at the Battle of Santiago, Cuba. Under the command of Rear Admiral William Sampson, battleships Texas, Oregon, Iowa, Indiana, and Massachusetts, along with an armored cruiser, New York, were ordered to seek out another fleet that had been dispatched from Spain. In addition, a squadron of ships under the command of Commodore Winfield Schley also joined the search. The forces of Schley and Sampson finally corralled the Spanish fleet at Santiago, Cuba. The Spanish, badly outnumbered, attempted to avoid the battle by retreating. However, in less than 3 hours, U.S. ships had succeeded in destroying the entire enemy fleet. It would become one of the most lopsided battles in naval history, with over 450 Spanish sailors either dead or wounded, and only 1 American dead and 1 wounded. Victories over the Spanish fleet produced excitement and praise for a Navy that had spent most of its history struggling for popular support. 1901 saw the election of Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency, and true to his commitment while he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, He set out to build a navy powerful enough to defend American interests anywhere. Within 10 years, the U.S. Navy had become the second most powerful navy in the world, building 30 battleships, 10 armored cruisers, and 6 true cruisers. Meanwhile, overseas, the world was witnessing a similar buildup by other nations, namely Germany and Japan. So Roosevelt, believing that the U.S. should have world influence equal to its stature and power, ordered his now prominent fleet painted white and set to sea for a show of strength. The Great White Fleet, as it was known, spent nearly 2 years steaming around the globe before returning to Hampton Roads. Roosevelt considered this exhibition of his big stick policy to be his greatest contribution to world peace. May 7, 1915 marked a turning point in world peace for the United States. The sinking of the Lusitania, a British cruise ship killing 128 American citizens, brings an escalating European war to the forefront in the United States. The war in Europe had been viewed by U.S. observers as one that would be brief, allowing us to remain impartial. It became, however, a stagnant trench war with little progress from either side. Military strategy turned once more to the sea, hoping to bring about victory through naval blockade, Britain mobilizing its vast fleets of dreadnoughts, and Germany her U-boats. The United States, convinced in the wake of the Lusitania disaster that a state of preparedness was in order, made plans for a naval buildup that would include construction of 156 ships at a cost of $500 million. President Wilson declared, "Let us build the biggest navy in the world. Then we can do as we please." In February 1917, Germany, in a desperate attempt to starve Britain into submission, ordered unrestricted warfare by submarines against all neutral and hostile merchant shipping found in British waters. German U-boats exacted a terrible toll on British merchant fleets, and within weeks had also sunk several U.S. merchant vessels. April 6, 1917, the United States entered World War I. Within 1 month, we had dispatched a destroyer division to Britain to assist in the fight against German U's. Nonetheless, merchant ships were still being sunk faster than they could be replaced, leaving Britain in great danger of being starved into defeat. U.S. Rear Admiral William Sims, who had been sent to Britain to assess the situation, sent an urgent message to Washington to send battleships as fast and as many as could be spared, or all would be lost. Then he, in conjunction with British officers, developed a two-phase strategy, which would include active patrols by U.S. battleships against U-boats, and an elaborate system of convoys for escorting merchant ships and transports into British waters. Within months, merchant losses began to drop. For the remainder of the war, American shipyards were able to supply new transports as fast as Germany could sink them. Although U.S. naval involvement was primarily that of troop and merchant transport and protection, her combat role during submarine patrols helped to contain German U's that would otherwise prowl unchallenged. Of notable mention was the capture of U-58 by the destroyer Fanning. While protecting a convoy, Coxswain David Loomis spotted a periscope barely 400 yards away. Fanning broke off with the sub and sent a barrage of depth charges into the area where she was spotted. In minutes, the sea erupted, and U-58 surfaced and surrendered. The war on German U-boats was complemented by still another craft, which enjoyed the fastest growth of any in the Navy during the war: aircraft. Operating from bases on Allied soil, 54 planes, along with blimps and kite balloons, joined the search for German subs and provided valuable reconnaissance as well as bombing raids on submarine bases and subs at sea. By the end of the war, naval aircraft in active duty numbered over 2,000. In the years following World War I, world powers found themselves locked in complex negotiations involving naval strength and buildup. The Washington Conference for the Limitation of Naval Armaments got underway in November 1921. Their principal task was to resolve current and future naval expansions in the hope that a favorable balance of world sea power could be established and maintained. A resolution was ultimately accepted and ratios were established for ships and nations that would limit the size and strength of world navies. For the United States, the limited naval buildup would create a serious handicap for our commitments in the Far East. Military strategists theorized that a simultaneous war on the Atlantic and Pacific could leave American interests in the Pacific undefendable. New tactics would be required. Aircraft and aircraft carriers would fill the void. By the close of World War I, many within the naval ranks considered aircraft to be a strong addition to naval offensive warfare, and were convinced any world naval power would require air strength and aircraft carriers capable of becoming mobile airfields anywhere in the world. The Navy was granted an old collier named Jupiter, and she was converted into the first U.S. aircraft carrier and renamed Langley. Fleet aviation advocates would soon find an ally in Army Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, who boldly proclaimed that battleships were as obsolete as knights in armor after gunpowder was invented. He set out to prove his claim by issuing a challenge: planes against boats. In July 1921, an old captured German dreadnought was anchored off the Virginia Capes. It was to be the prize that Billy Mitchell hoped to claim. He led a group of 7 planes equipped with 2,000-pound bombs over the target, and in short order, he sent the dreadnought to her grave. This test would complement the experiments done almost a decade earlier by a civilian flyer named Eugene Ely. On November 14, 1910, he successfully accomplished the first ship-to-shore flight from a temporary platform attached to the bow of the Birmingham. This historic first was followed 2 months later by the first landing of an aircraft aboard a ship, again by Ely. Taking off with just a bicycle inner tube for a life preserver, Ely landed a plane on a temporary wooden platform mounted on board the Pennsylvania. He was brought to a stop by snagging ropes tied to sandbags along the platform. August 10, 1921 saw the most significant development of all in fleet aviation: the creation of the Bureau of Aeronautics under the direction of Rear Admiral William Moffett. His first priority: get aircraft carriers in the water. Battle cruisers, which had earlier been scrapped as part of the Naval Limitation Treaty, were transformed into aircraft carriers Lexington and Saratoga. They were commissioned in 1927. In addition, Ranger, which would be the Navy's first carrier built from the ground up, would be authorized that same year. New technology was also developed to improve braking for incoming aircraft and was installed on all new carriers. From the beginning, the naval aviators trained for real combat conditions and perfected tactics such as long-range scouting, navigation, ship recognition, and coordinated attacks by dive bombers from above and torpedo planes low along the water. This trend in naval and air buildup was fueled by the rising threat of war with both Germany and Japan. And with the exception of the Depression years, the Navy enjoyed continuous growth in all classes of naval ships and planes. Then it happened. Bracing for war on either sea, it erupted at Pearl Harbor in the Pacific December 7, 1941. Airfields dotting the island of Oahu bore the fury of the first wave of Japanese planes. When they had finished, over 3/4 of the U.S. aircraft were reduced to shattered, twisted rubble. Next, Japanese torpedo planes and dive bombers directed their attentions toward the battleships. Arizona, West Virginia, Oklahoma, California, Maryland, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Nevada. For nearly 2 hours, none was spared the continuous pounding of torpedoes, bombs, and machine gun fire. Pearl Harbor had become the worst disaster in the history of the United States Navy. American dead or wounded totaled nearly 3,600. The Japanese had won the day. However, they failed to win victory over U.S. determination and pride. Except for the Arizona, all the battleships were raised and restored, and all but the Oklahoma returned to battle. In addition, the Japanese attack also failed to catch the 3 aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet at home during their raid. While the U.S. immersed itself in the task of rebuilding the Pacific Fleet, war raged on. In the Pacific, Japanese control over the East Indies and Pacific spread swiftly. In the Atlantic, Germany mustered its long-range U-boats and wreaked havoc on merchant shipping and battle wagons alike. U-boats were even stationed within 30 miles off the coast of New York and the Virginia Capes, sinking ships in view of spectators on the shore. All efforts were mobilized for the fight. Construction of destroyers with forward-firing depth charges, as well as carrier escorts, were given the highest priority. Standardization of freighter and tanker designs was implemented, allowing U.S. shipyards to efficiently replace downed vessels and ultimately build them faster than the U's could sink them. In addition, relentless work was begun to intercept and decipher German radio transmissions, which could provide advanced warning of impending underwater strikes. Operation Neptune, the naval side of the Normandy invasion, would go down in history as the greatest invasion fleet that the world had ever witnessed. Naval guns poured a continuous barrage of shells onto strategic enemy strongholds, while hundreds of thousands of men stormed onto the beaches of France, and ultimately onto victory in the European theater of operations. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, surviving ships of the Pacific Fleet, along with the carriers that were missing from Pearl during the Japanese attack, rallied for the fight against a mighty Japanese fleet. Their directive was to protect existing holdings and strike when they could. And strike they did. On April 18, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Doolittle, against the odds, departed the carrier Hornet to lead an air raid on the mainland of Japan. His formation of B-25s caught the Japanese completely by surprise and rained down terror from the sky on the city of Tokyo. Although the raid provided little strategic success, it brought a message loud and clear that the Yankees are here and here to stay. Meanwhile, carrier task forces of the Lexington and the Yorktown were ordered into the Coral Sea region to engage the Japanese. Aircraft launched a successful raid against a Japanese landing party. 3 days later, they sank a small Japanese carrier, Shoho. But the following morning, the U.S. fleet finally located 2 Japanese carriers of roughly similar strength, and the Coral Sea erupted. Torpedo planes and bombers were launched by both the United States and Japanese, both sides inflicting serious damage on the other. When the battle was over, the Americans had lost 3 ships, including the carrier Lexington, and over 70 planes. The Japanese had lost 1 small carrier and 3 small ships. Militarily, the Japanese had done greater damage. However, strategically, the U.S. emerged the victor. For the first time in the war, the Japanese offensive had been prevented from bulldozing over the American fleet. It demonstrated the U.S. Navy's willingness and capability to fight, and it shot a hole in the Japanese notion of unquestionable superiority in the Pacific. The Battle of the Coral Sea also distinguished itself as the first battle ever to be fought where ships on both sides neither saw their opponent nor fired a single shot. The real turning point of the war, however, would occur 1 month later. The U.S., having deciphered the Japanese communication code, learned that a major Japanese offensive was planned for Midway Island. Within days, the U.S. had a fleet of carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines racing for Midway. On June 4, 1942, U.S. reconnaissance planes launched from Midway Island detected the Japanese approach, and every available plane on Midway was put into the air. They would, however, be no match for the Japanese Zeros, which had launched a counterattack against the U.S. planes and the ground bases on the island. Meanwhile, a second wave of Zeros was preparing for launch when Japanese reconnaissance reported U.S. carriers in the area. In a frantic change in strategy, the Japanese carriers were ordered to reload their second wave of planes with torpedoes for a strike against U.S. carriers instead of land bases. This delay proved fatal for the Japanese because before the planes could be refitted and brought up onto the flight decks, returning Zeros from the Midway strike had landed, desperate for fuel and out of ammunition. This was the condition of the Japanese fleet when aircraft launched from U.S. carriers spotted their target. Bomb after bomb tore and ripped at the Japanese carriers, sending geysers of flame into the air. In all, 4 Japanese carriers were sunk and over 250 planes were lost, forcing the Japanese command to withdraw. The Battle of Midway was the first decisive loss inflicted on the Japanese Imperial Navy since the war began, and it marked the beginning of the end for Japan. The trend toward aircraft carriers over battle wagons was brought to the forefront during the War for the Pacific. Never before in history had aircraft played such a significant part in the outcome of any war, and this would not have been possible without the floating air bases that could deploy aircraft anywhere it was needed during World War II. Before World War II would draw to a close, there would emerge another class of ships that could proudly announce we were there. The fighting fleet of submariners. While often considered more of a defensive weapon, submarines and their crews proved to the world they were part of the proud tradition of fighting Navy ships. Submarines and their usefulness in war first gained recognition during World War I, with the seemingly ever-present stalking German U-boats. However, submarines trace their roots all the way back to the Revolutionary War. The Turtle, although she was never carried on the official naval register, would remain the most revolutionary development in marine warfare until the Monitor. David Bushnell, a student at Yale College, was the inventor and builder. Turtle contained just enough room for one person, and was propelled by a hand crank attached to a propeller. In 1776, the Turtle performed its one and only mission. Under the cover of night, she set out towing a bomb to attack a British warship anchored in New York Harbor. But the raid had to be abandoned because Turtle ran out of air. The next venture into undersea warfare occurred during the Civil War with the Confederate ship Hunley in 1864. She was constructed from a 25-foot section of iron boiler, 4 feet wide and about 6 feet deep. The ship was powered by men turning a crankshaft connected to a propeller. On the night of February 17, 1864, she launched out into the Charleston harbor, submerged, and attached an explosive charge to the hull of the Union ship Housatonic. As she was pulling away, the bomb went off. Hunley succeeded in becoming the first underwater vessel to sink a ship in wartime. However, she and her entire crew were also lost. For a time, the U.S. Navy was slow to embrace the concept of undersea vessels, so progress was championed in the private sector. John Holland, an Irish-born inventor, funded and built his first submarine, the Plunger, in 1897. It was 85 feet long and carried 2 torpedo tubes. However, it failed to meet Navy criteria for surface speed and had to be abandoned. Next, he launched a smaller gasoline and battery-powered submarine called Holland. She produced a surface speed of approximately 7 knots, but had no provision for sight underwater. Nonetheless, during testing, she caught the eye of then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt, and became the official property of the U.S. Navy in 1900. In the succeeding years, submarines grew in size, range, and power. The development of improved navigational equipment and diesel engines gave them ability for long, sustained cruising, and made them safer. From this point on, naval buildup would include submarines. In fact, near the beginning of World War I, the U.S. Navy actually had more submarines commissioned than did Germany. But it would not be until World War II that the Navy began to take full advantage of submarine offensive power. From the onset of war in the Pacific, submarines were a part of the action. By 1944, U.S. submarines were having their way with the Japanese Navy and merchant ships alike. Sandlance, for example, was able to sink 2 freighters in the midst of drift ice and fog, then went on to intercept a large convoy headed for the Marianas and sank a light cruiser and 2 transports. Another Japanese convoy bound for New Guinea had similar misfortune with 2 other U.S. subs, Sea Lion and Archerfish. Sea Lion sank the Japanese battleship Congo, recording the first confirmed kill of a battleship by any submarine. Archerfish, several days later, fired on the Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier in the world at that time, and recorded a similar naval first. The net loss of ships and men was staggering. In fact, by late in 1944, the Japanese merchant ships had been so severely ravaged by U.S. subs that Japan's economy was forced to continue the war with less provisions than were needed to maintain a pre-war civilian economy. U.S. subs had placed a noose around Japan's neck and were slowly tightening the knot. In all, U.S. subs had sunk 1,150 merchant ships and 214 major naval vessels. In addition to battle missions, U.S. subs also provided a means for shuttling supplies, ammunition, and troops to enemy-held islands along the Pacific. Submarine periscopes were fitted with camera equipment and began providing close-up reconnaissance information. But one of the most cherished non-combat roles that they performed was aviator rescue. In fact, it was so efficient that submarine lifeguards became a regular part of airstrikes. Dozens of pilots were rescued, including one man who was shot down in Tokyo Bay. The Turtle, from its modest beginnings, began a tradition of undersea warfare that would continue through all the major naval wars, the forefather that would be reshaped, retooled, redesigned, and ultimately usher the U.S. Navy into the nuclear age. Underway under nuclear power was the message sent by Commander Eugene Wilkinson on January 17, 1955, as Nautilus became the first ship of the U.S. Navy to employ the technology of the new age. Painted in black with a blunt nose, this sleek submarine was the first nuclear-powered submarine in the world. Unlike its predecessors, Nautilus could remain submerged indefinitely. She was powered by nuclear reactors which created steam for her turbines but required no oxygen and emitted no exhaust. Special equipment purified the air for the crew. Her maiden voyage was an overwhelming success, and nuclear power was hailed as the most important breakthrough in technology since the Ironclads. In 1958, Nautilus would record the first underwater navigation from the Pacific to the Atlantic under the polar ice cap. 2 years later, Nautilus's sister ship Triton would stun the naval communities with her submerged circumnavigation of the globe in an unprecedented time of 83 days. In addition, she was equipped with the most modern navigation equipment, allowing her to accurately calculate her course without ever surfacing. Nuclear power had so revolutionized naval capabilities that it wasn't long before surface ships adopted it as their power plant of choice. First to emerge was the cruiser Long Beach. In addition to being nuclear-powered, she was the first warship built since World War II to be armed with guided missiles rather than heavy guns as her main armament. Aircraft carriers would also follow suit in nuclear power in the early 1960s with the Enterprise, the world's largest warship in history. This mammoth vessel was powered by 8 nuclear reactors, allowing her speeds in excess of 35 knots, and with the capability of producing steam power for years without refueling. In addition, this super carrier was fitted with offset flight decks totaling over 300 yards long and equipped with 4 modern steam catapults, giving her the capability to launch one plane every 30 seconds. Research and development would become the keynote for the modern Navy. Change would be the outcome. New technologies would supersede old ones, and newer still would replace those. This would be the trend in the future, just as it had been in the past. Great ships, along with great men, have always met the challenges that accompany change, and through it all have sustained the Navy's historical mission of preserving the peace and keeping open the sea lanes of the world, just as their forefathers had done.